Welcome to our deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
You've given us a fascinating collection of excerpts about ancient Britons,
Yes.
specifically focusing on a historical perspective on gypsies
Right.
and their complex relationship with society.
It's a fascinating topic.
Our source material for this deep dive is Ancient and Modern Britons II, a retrospect.
A very interesting book.
And quite an old one.
Late 19th century.
Yeah. So let's dive into these historical accounts to see what they reveal about the origins of gypsy culture,
Okay.
the shifting definitions of societal norms,
Interesting.
and the intriguing traces they've left on modern Britain.
Sounds good.
Now the text jumps right into this fascinating figure, Billy Marshall,
Oh, yeah.
a prominent Galloway gypsy from the 1700s.
Okay.
And get this,
What's that?
he supposedly had 17 wives.
Wow.
That's just mind-boggling, isn't it?
It certainly makes you wonder about the cultural differences at play.
Yeah.
17 wives would have been outrageous
Right,
in mainstream society.
of course.
But within gypsy culture,
Yeah,
it seems to point to a different set of values and social structures.
you're right.
It really does.
It begs the question,
What that?
what did marriage represent within gypsy culture?
Right.
And how did those views contrast with broader societal norms?
Good question.
It's like we're already seeing this tension between different ways of life right from the start.
Absolutely.
And it gets even more interesting when you consider that Billy Marshall had possible aristocratic connections.
Interesting.
The text even mentions that his funeral was funded by the Earl and Countess of Selkirk.
Wow. That's a pretty big deal.
Right.
Yeah.
It suggests a much more complex social standing than simply being an outlaw.
I agree.
It's like those lines between the fringes of society and the nobility were much blurrier than we might imagine.
Exactly. Those details challenge our assumptions.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a simple story of outcasts versus the establishment.
Right.
There were layers of connection and influence that we need to unpack.
It makes you wonder about the true power dynamics at play, doesn't it?
It does.
Who held sway over whom?
Right. Right.
And how did those relationships shape perceptions of gypsy culture?
These are excellent questions.
Okay.
And these themes of power and perception are something we'll see echoed throughout this deep dive.
Okay.
Now, moving beyond Billy Marshall,
Okay.
the text also delves into physical descriptions of gypsies.
And I was surprised to find that it actually challenges the stereotype of exclusively dark features.
It does.
Some accounts mention a variety of appearances,
Yeah.
including fair skin
Right.
and red hair.
Yes. It shatters that monolithic image right away.
Yeah,
It's crucial to remember we're talking about diverse groups of people,
of course.
not a single homogeneous entity.
Right.
And that diversity is reflected in their appearances as well.
It's so important to keep that in mind, especially when we're confronted with stereotypes.
It is.
And speaking of diversity,
Right.
the descriptions of their clothing are all over the map, too.
Interesting.
Some accounts mention near nakedness,
Mm.
while others describe elaborate attire reminiscent of nobility.
It's almost as if their outward appearance intentionally defied easy categorization.
Right.
It further complicates our understanding of how gypsies were perceived and the roles they played within society.
It certainly adds another layer of intrigue.
It does.
And then there's this curious detail about certain gypsy customs like side locks and pigtails appearing even among naval officers.
That's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests a level of cultural exchange,
Yeah.
maybe even an adoption of certain styles between groups
Right.
that we might assume were completely separate.
It really makes you think about the subtle ways cultures interact and influence each other,
It does.
even in those times when those groups might have been at odds in other ways.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that interplay between different cultural groups is something we'll see come up again and again.
Okay.
Now, the text introduces a concept that might seem jarring to modern ears.
Okay.
Blackmail.
Yeah. That's a term loaded with negative connotations today.
It is.
But historically, it was seen as an accepted form of tribute, wasn't it?
It was. And understanding that shift in meaning is crucial.
Yeah.
In this context, blackmail wasn't about extortion in the criminal sense.
Right.
It was more about these groups negotiating their survival
Yeah.
within a society that often viewed them with suspicion or hostility.
So it was a way for these groups to exert influence and ensure their security,
It was.
even if it meant bending the rules that were considered acceptable by mainstream society.
Precisely. They were operating within a different set of societal norms.
Okay.
And this blackmail system seems to have been part of that.
That's a really thought-provoking point.
It is.
It makes you question whose rules are being followed
Right.
and how those rules are shaped by power dynamics.
Exactly. And speaking of power dynamics, the text connects blackmail to the Tory classes,
Okay.
those adhering to older,
Yeah.
sometimes outlawed customs.
So we're seeing this recurring theme of dominant versus marginalized groups throughout history,
We are.
where those in power get to dictate what's acceptable
Right.
and label those who don't conform as outsiders.
It's a pattern that plays out repeatedly.
Yeah.
The historical examples in the text,
Yeah.
like the Black Danes
Okay.
and the Huns,
Yeah.
illustrate this clash between those who hold power and those who challenge or operate outside of those established norms.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about facts and dates.
It's not.
It's about understanding those power struggles
It is.
and how they've shaped the world we live in today.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the fascinating case of the Bailey clan,
Okay.
described as a white gypsy clan with claims to high lineage.
Wow. Talk about challenging stereotypes.
It is
They
interesting.
weren't what I pictured at all when I hear the word gypsy.
Right.
And the text says they often wore elaborate, expensive attire,
They did.
which completely disrupts the image of gypsies as solely impoverished wanderers.
It certainly does. And it raises the question,
Yeah.
how much did appearance and outward displays of wealth influence perceptions of gypsies within society?
Right.
Were they viewed differently if they dressed in finery?
It's like those outward markers of status played a role in how they were treated and the opportunities they were given.
Yes, and it connects to that enduring fascination with bloodlines and ancestry.
Okay.
The text even shares an anecdote about Mrs. Carlyle,
Okay.
a well-known literary figure,
Right.
possibly having a gypsy relative
Huh.
connected to Meg Merrilies from Scott's novels.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder how many hidden connections like that exist throughout history,
It does.
subtly linking different social strata in ways we might never expect.
It suggests a much more intricate
Yeah.
and intertwined social fabric than we might initially imagine.
Okay.
And it makes us reconsider those rigid classifications that we often impose on the past.
It's like we're constantly peeling back layers and discovering new complexities that reshape our understanding.
We are.
And it makes you think, how much does lineage still influence our perceptions of individuals and groups today?
Right.
Do we unconsciously favor those with perceived noble bloodlines?
It's a question worth pondering.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the enduring power of ancestry in shaping our social interactions,
Right.
even if we don't always acknowledge it.
Definitely food for thought.
It is.
Now, the text goes on to analyze the use of the title king,
Okay.
and not just in the traditional sense.
Right.
It mentions figures like the King of the Foz, who
Right.
is a historical leader,
Right.
but also more localized kings within gypsy communities.
That's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah.
It highlights the fragmented power structure of earlier centuries,
Right.
where the authority of a central monarch might have been limited or challenged in certain regions,
Yeah.
or among certain groups.
It's a far cry from the centralized power structures we're accustomed to today.
It is.
Back then, authority was often more localized
Right.
and contested,
Yeah.
creating this complex web of allegiances
Yes.
and rivalries.
It really paints a picture of a very different world.
It does.
And the text uses the Kennedys,
Okay.
known as the Kings of Carrick,
Okay.
as a prime example.
Yeah.
They commanded respect
Yeah.
and held influence,
Right.
but were also embroiled in violent feuds,
Wow.
showcasing those complexities of power and authority.
They were a powerful clan,
They were.
but their power wasn't absolute.
Right.
They faced challenges
Uh-huh.
and rivalries,
Yeah.
and they often resorted to violence to maintain their position.
They did.
It highlights the precarious nature of power,
Right.
even for those who seem to hold a dominant position.
It's like they commanded respect, but also instilled a sense of fear. A delicate balance of power that could shift at any moment.
Absolutely.
It was a world where power was often maintained through force.
Yeah.
Or the threat of force.
And this brings us to the bigger picture, doesn't it?
It does.
How have those definitions of power and authority shifted throughout British history?
Right.
And how do those shifts relate to the story of gypsies and their relationship with broader society?
Those are excellent questions. It's clear that the concept of power has evolved significantly over time.
Right.
It's not as simple as saying that monarchs held all the authority.
Of course.
There were always those who challenged those established structures,
Right.
those who operated within their own spheres of influence.
And understanding those nuances is essential for understanding the complex relationship between gypsies and the broader society they were part of.
It is.
They were clearly impacted by those shifts in power,
Yeah.
but they also exerted their own forms of influence and agency.
It's a much more dynamic and multifaceted story than we might assume at first glance.
Right.
And it's one that requires us to reconsider those traditional narratives about who held power
Yeah.
and how that power was wielded.
I'm already seeing these historical accounts in a whole new light. It's like we're peeling back layers of assumption and uncovering a much richer and more nuanced understanding of the past.
We are.
And I can't wait to see what other revelations await us as we continue our deep dive.
I'm equally eager to see where this journey takes us.
Yeah.
There's much more to uncover.
Okay.
And I have a feeling there will be plenty more surprises along the way.
Okay. Picking up where we left off.
Okay.
The text introduces us to the Levelers,
Good.
a group from the 1600s
Right.
who were advocating for communal land rights.
Interesting.
It's fascinating to see how their ideals clashed with the individualistic land ownership that was becoming dominant at the time.
It was a real clash of ideologies, wasn't it?
Yeah.
On one hand, you had the levelers
Right.
who believed in the collective good and shared ownership of resources.
Okay.
And on the other,
Yeah.
you had this emerging emphasis on private property
Right.
and individual accumulation of wealth.
And the text specifically highlights the conflict between the levelers and gypsy groups over land use, right? It's almost like these two groups represented those opposing worldviews.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just an abstract philosophical debate.
Right.
It played out in real-world disputes over land and resources.
Yeah.
The gypsies, with their nomadic lifestyle
Right.
and communal practices,
Yeah.
represented a challenge to those who sought to enclose land and establish clear boundaries of ownership.
It makes you think about how those shifts in societal norms can lead to real friction and conflict between groups with different values. It wasn't just about who had the legal right to the land.
Right.
It was about two very different ways of life coming into conflict.
And that tension between communal and individualistic values is something we still grapple with today, isn't it?
I think so.
Think about the debates we have about public versus private land use,
Right.
or the balance between collective good and individual rights.
These are themes that resonate throughout history and continue to shape our world.
They do.
It's amazing how those historical echoes can still be felt in our modern-day dilemmas.
It is.
It shows how deeply intertwined these issues are with our social and economic structures.
Speaking of which,
Yeah.
the text goes on to analyze the use of the title king,
Okay.
and not just for monarchs.
Right.
It's fascinating how that term was applied to various figures,
Yeah.
from historical leaders like the King of the Faws
Right.
to those who held more localized authority within gypsy communities.
It's like the concept of king held different meanings and levels of authority depending on the context. It wasn't always about ruling over vast territories or
Right.
commanding armies.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was about holding sway over a specific group or region,
Right.
wielding influence within a smaller sphere.
Exactly. It reflects the fragmented power structures of those times.
Right.
Authority wasn't always centralized in a single figure, like
Yeah.
a king or queen.
Okay.
There were pockets of influence,
Yeah.
local power brokers who commanded respect
That's right.
and loyalty within their own communities
Okay.
or spheres of influence.
It paints a much more complex picture of how power operated in those times.
It does.
And the text uses the Kennedys, known as the Kings of Carrick.
Okay.
It's a great example.
Right.
They were both respected figures
Yes.
and embroiled in violent feuds,
Right.
showcasing those complexities of power and authority.
They were a powerful clan,
They were.
but their power wasn't absolute.
Right.
They faced challenges
Uh-huh.
and rivalries.
Yeah.
And they often resorted to violence to maintain their position.
It highlights the precarious nature of power,
It does.
even for those who seem to hold a dominant position.
It's like they commanded respect,
Yeah.
but also instilled a sense of fear. A delicate balance of power that could shift at any moment.
And this theme of shifting power dynamics is something we see throughout British history, isn't it?
It is.
The very definition of what it means to be a king
Right.
or hold authority has evolved over time.
It has.
It's not a static concept.
Okay.
It's been shaped by social,
Yeah.
political, and
Right.
economic forces.
It prompts us to consider how power structures have changed
Yeah,
and whether we've truly moved beyond those older,
right.
more fragmented forms of authority.
Do those echoes of localized power struggles still exist within our modern systems?
It's a good question.
And how do they manifest?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah,
And they remind us that history isn't just about the past.
right.
It's about understanding the roots of our present-day realities.
Now, shifting gears a bit,
Okay,
the text delves into a fascinating detail,
what's that?
the language of Romanis.
Oh, interesting.
It's described as the language of gypsies.
Right.
And what's truly mind-blowing is the suggestion that it might be connected to ancient Egyptian.
That's a tantalizing link, isn't it?
It is.
It adds another layer of mystery to the story of gypsies
Right.
and their origins.
And it speaks to the possibility of cultural connections and exchanges that span vast distances,
Yes.
time periods.
It's like a linguistic bridge,
It's
connecting different
very-
cultures and historical periods.
And what I find truly amazing
Yeah.
is the idea that certain Romeri's words might actually preserve older forms of English pronunciation.
Interesting.
The text mentions Bobby for money
Okay.
and Sivomengro for tailor as examples.
Those words are like linguistic time capsules.
Yeah,
They offer us glimpses into how language has evolved
right.
and how certain groups might have preserved pronunciations or word usages that have disappeared from mainstream language.
It's like a hidden treasure trove of linguistic history.
It is.
And it makes you wonder what other linguistic gems are out there,
Wh-
waiting to be discovered in the languages of groups who've been marginalized or overlooked.
It underscores the importance of studying and preserving linguistic diversity.
It does.
Not only does it allow us to appreciate the richness of human expression,
Right.
but it also provides valuable insights into the history of language
Yeah.
and the interconnectedness of cultures.
It's a reminder that knowledge and understanding can come from the most unexpected places,
It is.
and that we lose something precious when we allow languages to die out.
Now, as we move further into the text,
Okay.
we encounter this recurring theme of contrasting lifestyles.
Yeah.
The settled versus the nomadic,
Right.
those who embraced the emerging power structures,
Yeah.
and those who clung to older,
Yeah.
often outlawed customs.
Right. It's a tension that runs throughout history.
It does.
And it's particularly evident in the story of gypsies.
The text uses the term Tory to describe those groups who adhered to those older traditions
Okay.
and resisted assimilation into the dominant culture.
It's a term that's often associated with political ideologies.
It is.
But in this context, it seems to represent a broader resistance to change
Right.
and a desire to preserve a way of life that was increasingly at odds with the emerging social order.
It's fascinating how clothing is used in the text to illustrate this contrast.
Okay.
We see accounts of gypsies wearing elaborate clothing,
Right.
challenging the stereotype of them being solely impoverished wanderers.
Yeah.
It suggests that their attire was a deliberate statement of their identity,
Okay.
a way to distinguish themselves from the increasingly homogenized society around them.
It's like their clothing served as a visual marker of their cultural identity,
It did.
a way to assert their difference and their refusal to conform to those pressures to assimilate.
And this resistance to assimilation is something we often see in marginalized groups, isn't it?
I do.
They hold on to their traditions as a way to preserve their culture,
Right.
their sense of self,
Yeah.
in the face of those external pressures.
It makes you wonder,
What's that?
are there modern-day equivalents of these Tory classes?
It's a good question.
Groups or individuals who are perceived as being out of step with prevailing norms,
Yeah.
or who resist certain aspects of modern life.
It's a thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
Are those who resist technological advancements,
Okay.
those who advocate for alternative lifestyles,
Right.
or those who challenge the status quo,
Yeah.
the modern-day Tories?
Are they simply holding on to outdated ways of thinking?
Right.
Or are they expressing a legitimate resistance to homogenization and the loss of cultural diversity?
It's like history is repeating itself
Yeah.
in a new context
Right.
with different players,
Yeah.
but similar dynamics of resistance and societal pressure.
It's a reminder that those tensions between tradition and progress are always present,
They are.
even as the specifics of those conflicts evolve.
And this brings us back to that question of shifting societal norms.
Yeah.
What was once considered normal
Right.
or acceptable can become marginalized.
Yeah.
Or even outlawed over time.
Right.
As new ideas and power structures emerge.
The text provides a great example with the concept of blackmail,
Okay.
which, as we discussed earlier, was
Yeah.
historically accepted as a form of tribute,
It was.
but would be considered extortion today.
It highlights how our ethical and legal frameworks evolve,
Right.
often in response to changing power dynamics
Yeah.
and societal values.
What was once seen as a legitimate way to negotiate for resources or protection
Right.
can become criminalized as those power dynamics shift.
It's a constant push and pull
Yeah.
between tradition and progress, isn't it?
Each generation redefines what is deemed acceptable or unacceptable behavior.
Right.
And those definitions are often shaped by who holds power
Right.
and whose interests are being served.
And that tension between tradition and progress is something we continue to grapple with in countless ways. Think about the debates we have about social justice,
Okay.
technological advancements,
Yeah.
or the role of government in regulating individual behavior.
Yeah.
These are all issues that touch on those fundamental questions of what's acceptable,
Right.
what's ethical,
Yeah.
and how we navigate those shifting societal norms. It's like those echoes of those historical clashes are still reverberating in our modern world,
Fine so.
prompting us to reconsider those boundaries
No.
between what's acceptable
Yeah.
and what's considered outside the bounds of societal norms.
Now, the text takes us into some fascinating territory
Oh.
as it explores the concept of bloodlines
Okay.
and ancestry.
The Bailey clan,
Yeah.
with their claims of high lineage,
Right.
really challenges that notion that all gypsies were of a singular, lowly origin.
It disrupts those stereotypes and forces us to rethink those assumptions about social hierarchies.
It's a great example of how appearances can be deceiving,
Right.
and how those assumptions about lineage and social status can be easily challenged
Yeah.
when we delve deeper into the complexities of history.
The Baileys, with their claims of noble ancestry and their displays of wealth,
Yes.
disrupt that simplistic narrative of gypsies as a homogenous group relegated to the margins of society.
And there's that intriguing anecdote about Mrs. Carlyle
Oh.
possibly having a gypsy relative,
Right.
suggesting that those lineages could be more intertwined with well-known figures than we realize.
It makes you wonder how many of those hidden connections exist,
It does.
subtly linking different social strata in ways that we might never suspect.
It's like those historical divisions between different social classes were more porous than we might imagine,
Right.
with unexpected connections
Yeah.
and intermingling occurring beneath the surface.
And it makes us question those rigid classifications that we often impose on the past,
Very strong.
recognizing that social mobility,
Right.
both upward and downward,
Yeah.
was more common than we might think.
It's like peeling back the layers of history
Yeah.
and uncovering a more nuanced
Right.
and interconnected past
Right.
than we've been led to believe.
It challenges those simplistic narratives.
It does.
And forces us to confront the messy,
Yeah.
complicated realities of human interaction
Right.
and social dynamics.
And it prompts us to question the very notion of pure bloodlines.
Yeah.
How much does our ancestry truly define us?
Right.
And how have our perceptions of lineage evolved over time?
Are we still as fixated on those ideas of blood purity
Right, yeah.
and inherited social status as our ancestors were?
It's a good question.
Or have we moved beyond those notions?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
And they speak to the enduring power of ancestry in shaping our identities
Right.
and social interactions.
Even if we don't always acknowledge it.
Now, as we delve deeper into the text,
Okay.
we encounter descriptions of gypsy customs and practices,
Oh.
some of which might seem shocking or even barbaric to our modern sensibilities.
The text mentions things like near nakedness,
Right?
the use of war paint,
Okay.
and even hints at cannibalism.
It's a far cry from that romanticized image of gypsies
Right.
that we often see in popular culture, isn't it?
It can be jarring to confront those descriptions,
You can.
especially when they clash so dramatically with our modern values.
It's a reminder that we're looking at these historical accounts through a modern lens,
Right.
with our own values and sensibilities shaping our interpretations.
It's like trying to understand a different world.
It is.
A world with its own set of rules and beliefs.
And sometimes those beliefs can seem strange,
Right.
even repulsive to us
Yeah.
today.
But it's important to remember that our goal isn't to judge those practices by our own standards.
It's not.
It's to try to understand them within their historical context.
And this brings us to a crucial point,
Okay.
the importance of avoiding presentism,
Okay.
which is that tendency to judge the past by the standards of the present.
It's a trap that's easy to fall into,
It is.
but it can lead to distorted and unfair interpretations of historical events and practices.
It's like we have to resist that urge to impose our own values on those who lived in a different time
Right.
and face different challenges.
We need to try to see the world through their eyes,
We do.
even if that means confronting beliefs and practices that make us uncomfortable.
It's through that effort to understand the past on its own terms
Yeah.
that we can glean those valuable insights into the complexities of human behavior and societal evolution.
We can start to see the connections between the past and the present,
I can.
recognizing those enduring patterns and themes that continue to shape our world.
So even though some of these historical descriptions might make us uncomfortable,
Yeah.
it's important to approach them with a sense of curiosity
Right.
and a willingness to learn.
We might not always agree with what we discover,
Right.
but we can certainly expand our understanding of the human experience.
And that's precisely the beauty of exploring history, isn't it?
I think so.
It challenges us to confront our own assumptions,
Right.
to broaden our perspective,
Yeah.
and to appreciate the incredible diversity of human experience across time and cultures.
Now, as we continue our exploration,
Okay.
we encounter this fascinating connection between gypsies and the world of minstrelsy and entertainment.
Interesting.
The text highlights how those groups often served as entertainers,
Yeah.
musicians,
Right.
and storytellers.
Preserving a rich oral tradition that predated the rise of written literature.
It's an interesting juxtaposition, isn't it?
It is.
On one hand, they were often marginalized
Right.
and viewed with suspicion.
Yeah.
But on the other hand,
Yeah.
they were valued for their artistic talents
Oh, yeah.
and their ability to entertain.
It's like they occupied a unique space within society,
Right.
both insiders
Yeah.
and outsiders.
Able to move between different social circles and share their stories and traditions with a wider audience.
Exactly.
They weren't confined to a single social stratum.
Right.
They could interact with both the elite and the common folk, bridging those social divides through their art and storytelling.
And that role as entertainers often gave them a platform to share their perspectives and experiences,
He did.
even if those perspectives weren't always welcomed
Right.
or embraced by the dominant culture.
It's fascinating to think about the power of art and storytelling to transcend boundaries and connect people from different backgrounds.
It is.
Even in those times when gypsies faced prejudice and discrimination,
Right.
they could still find ways to share their stories and traditions through music, dance, and
Ooh.
performance.
It reminds us that cultural exchange can happen in unexpected ways,
Yeah,
and that even those groups who are marginalized or excluded
right.
can find ways to exert influence
Yeah.
and leave their mark on society.
And it highlights the importance of preserving those oral traditions,
It does.
which often offer a different perspective on history and culture
Sure.
than we find in written records.
Those stories,
Yeah.
songs, and dances passed down through generations carry a wealth of knowledge and insight.
Providing a glimpse into the lives and experiences of those who might not have had the opportunity to document their own histories.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about grand narratives
Right.
and written documents.
It's also about the lived experiences and cultural practices of everyday people.
It is.
And those stories are often preserved through those oral traditions that have been passed down through generations.
Now, as we delve further into the text, we encounter intriguing details about the use of symbols and language within gypsy communities.
The text mentions things like tokens of protection,
Okay.
secret signs,
Right.
and the use of Romanes as a coded language that allowed them to communicate without being understood by outsiders.
It's like they developed their own forms of communication
Yeah.
as a way to maintain their cultural identity,
Right.
to protect themselves from a society that often viewed them with suspicion
Yeah.
or hostility.
Those symbols and secret languages served as a way to preserve their traditions and maintain a sense of community in the face of external pressures to conform.
And it speaks to their resourcefulness and adaptability in navigating a world that wasn't always welcoming.
Right.
They had to find ways to protect themselves,
Yeah.
to communicate with each other in ways that couldn't be easily intercepted
Right.
or understood by those who might seek to harm them or disrupt their way of life.
It's like they created their own world within a world
Yeah.
with its own customs,
Yeah.
language, and ways of understanding the world around them.
It was a way to preserve their unique identity
Right.
and resist those forces that sought to assimilate them into the dominant culture.
And this creation of a distinct cultural identity is something that we see in many marginalized groups throughout history, isn't it?
We do.
It's a way to create a sense of belonging and community,
Right.
to find strength and solidarity in shared traditions and
Yeah.
belief.
And to resist those pressures, to conform to the dictates of a society that might not fully accept or understand them.
It's a reminder that culture is not static.
It's not.
It's a dynamic force that adapts
Right.
and evolves in response to changing circumstances.
And for those groups who have faced marginalization
Right.
or exclusion,
That cultural adaptation often involves finding ways to preserve their traditions, their
That's-
language.
their ways of being,
Yeah.
even in the face of those pressures to assimilate.
And that's what makes exploring those historical accounts so fascinating.
It is.
They offer us glimpses into those processes of cultural adaptation
Right.
and resistance.
Reminding us that even in the face of adversity,
Yeah.
human beings find ways to maintain their identities,
Right.
their communities,
Yeah.
and their sense of belonging.
And those stories of resilience and cultural survival are as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
They are.
They offer us insights into the challenges faced by marginalized groups.
They do.
The importance of preserving cultural diversity
Yes.
and the enduring power of human connection in the face of adversity.
Absolutely.
And as we continue our deep dive,
Yeah.
we'll keep exploring those themes,
Right.
unpacking those historical accounts,
Right.
and uncovering those connections between the past
Yeah.
and the present.
I'm eager to see what other insights await us in the final part of this journey.
Me too.
It's been an incredible exploration so far.
It has.
And I can't wait to see how those pieces of the puzzle fit together to reveal a more complete picture
Right.
of this fascinating history.
Okay. As we wrap up our deep dive into ancient and modern Britons and their perspective on gypsies,
Yeah.
there's one element that keeps echoing in my mind.
Okay.
Romanes, their language.
Right.
It's like a key unlocking hidden doors in both culture and history.
It's a powerful reminder that language isn't just about communication.
Right.
It's about preserving cultural identity,
Yeah.
transmitting knowledge through generations, and even offering clues to the past.
What particularly struck you about Romanes?
Well,
Honestly, it's that potential connection to how English was spoken centuries ago.
oh, interesting.
The text mentions those examples like Bobby for money and Sivomengo for tailor,
Okay.
possibly preserving older pronunciations.
It's like a linguistic snapshot, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it reinforces this idea we've been touching on.
Right.
So-called marginalized groups often hold on to elements of culture
Yeah.
that mainstream society lets go.
It makes you wonder what other linguistic treasures are tucked away in languages spoken by groups who've been pushed to the fringes.
It does.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine the historical insights waiting to be discovered
Right.
if we pay attention to those variations in dialects.
It underscores why preserving linguistic diversity is so important.
It does.
Not just for respecting cultures,
Right.
but for understanding the journey of language itself.
Absolutely.
Now, the text also tantalizes us with that possible connection between Romanes and ancient Egyptian. It sparks the imagination, doesn't it?
It really does.
And it ties back to those earlier descriptions of gypsies being called Egyptians,
Right.
a label that might have more historical basis than we initially assumed.
It begs the question,
Yeah.
how far back do those connections stretch?
And what other cultural exchanges might have happened along the way,
Yeah.
shaping the Romese language and gypsy culture as a whole?
These historical accounts,
Yeah.
while limited,
Right.
are a starting point for some really intriguing investigations.
It's like we've only just begun to unravel a story far more complex and fascinating than we imagined.
It is.
And it emphasizes that open mind we need when approaching history,
Right.
that willingness to question what we think we know.
Now, shifting back to those societal clashes the text describes.
Right.
The conflicts between advocates for communal land rights, like the levelers,
Yeah.
and gypsy groups with their more nomadic lifestyles.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic that feels surprisingly relevant, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
It's this fundamental tension between different ways of life, isn't it?
It is.
Those valuing settled agriculture and clearly defined ownership
Right.
versus those who live more transiently,
Yeah.
relying on shared resources and a less fixed relationship with the land.
And the text highlights how the rise of individualistic land ownership during that time period exacerbated those conflicts.
Right.
It's like we're witnessing a societal shift towards privatization
Yeah.
and a move away from those traditional communal practices.
It makes you think about the long-term consequences of prioritizing individual gain over the collective good.
It does.
Are we still grappling with those same questions today,
Right, yeah.
especially as we face challenges like climate change and resource scarcity?
It's a crucial question to consider.
Yeah.
Those historical tensions remind us that how we interact with the land,
Yeah.
how we share resources.
Right.
These aren't just abstract debates.
Of course not.
They have real-world implications
Yeah.
for social harmony and even environmental sustainability.
No, we can't shy away from those descriptions of gypsy customs that the text includes, some of which might seem quite shocking to us today.
Right.
Practices like the use of war paint,
Okay.
near nakedness,
Yeah.
and even hints of cannibalism.
It forces us to confront the vast differences in cultural norms across time.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder that we need to approach historical accounts with a discerning eye,
Right.
acknowledging the author's own biases
Yeah.
and the prevailing societal norms of their era.
Our goal isn't to condone those practices,
It's not.
but to understand them within their historical context,
Right.
avoiding that trap of judging the past solely by the standards of the present.
It's like trying to step into a different world,
Right.
a world with its own logic and worldview.
Challenging, absolutely.
It is.
But it's through that effort to understand
Right.
rather than simply judge.
That we can glean those truly valuable insights into human behavior and the evolution of societies.
Well said.
Thank you.
It's through that open-minded approach that we can uncover the complexities of the past
Why can?
and draw those meaningful connections to the present.
As we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
it's amazing how much richer our understanding of gypsies in Britain has become.
We've challenged those monolithic stereotypes,
We have.
explored the fluid nature of power,
Right.
and even caught glimpses of those linguistic treasures hidden within their language.
And perhaps most importantly,
Yeah.
we've highlighted the importance of approaching history with humility,
Okay.
curiosity,
Yeah.
and a willingness to question our own assumptions.
It's been an incredible journey through these historical accounts.
It has.
We've unearthed so much more than facts and dates.
Right.
We've uncovered human stories,
Uh-huh.
cultural clashes, and enduring themes that resonate even today.
And that, I believe, is the true power of engaging with history.
Yeah.
It's not just about the past.
Right.
It's about understanding ourselves,
Yeah.
our world, and the complexities of the human experience across time.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course.
We hope you'll continue exploring those fascinating historical puzzles and keep challenging those assumptions about the world around us.